Okay, I think we're going to get started then. Hello everyone, and welcome to, got to get it. This is session C, Melancholy and Mourning, which is going to be with two of our contributors from the special issue of Gothic Studies, John Thomure and Andy Thatcher. We're very excited about this. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Um, we do have a symposium code of conduct that is in our printed program, but basically, just please use participants' preferred names, nicknames, and pronouns, and be respectful in all conversations in symposium spaces. If you have any questions that arise during the symposium, if you're here in person, uh, people have stickers that kind of identify them as someone you can ask. If you're online, our DM is Jess, who just welcomed everyone in the chat. So feel free to ask her any questions. Please be aware you're being recorded, and we may post these later. Uh, we've tried to build in a lot of breaks, but if you need to step away at any time, we completely understand. While we don't have a dedicated quiet room, there is one here in the library for our in-person participants. It is room 2318, which is in the corner of the second floor, which we are on. Restrooms are right behind us here in person. Vending machines are on the first floor. We also have food and drink in the back here. Um, we encourage all participants to use the hashtag Gothic Practice 2026 if you're posting about the symposium. And finally, because this symposium is focused at least in part on creative, critical work, we invite everyone to engage creatively and critically, creative note-taking, making art, however you wish to engage as we go along. So here in person, we have art materials, but if you're online, feel free to also make and create as we go along as well. But now it is my profound pleasure to introduce John Thomure and Andy Thatcher again, two contributors to our Gothic Practice special issue, and I'm very excited to see their presentations today. And we're going to start with John. So, John, it is yours to take away.
Fantastic. I'm going to test everyone's morning concentration because I don't have a slideshow. Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for joining Andy and I in discussing melancholy and mourning. And I want to spend some time this morning addressing the overarching themes and ideas which feature in my essay, Morning Praxis, which will be included in the upcoming issue of Gothic Studies. I want to keep this concise so that we have plenty of time to talk as a group during the Q&A. I think that's really important. So at certain points, I'll be talking in very broad strokes. If you have a question or something specifically you want to get into, I think throw it out there as a question, and I'm happy to talk about it. Of course, there's a lot of nuance involved in discussions of death and mourning, as they're very sensitive and personal topics for people. But what I'm trying to accomplish here is to reflect on the role of mourning as well as our relationship to death, and how it's become an extension today of capitalist ideology as opposed to a mourning praxis like the Irish funeral tradition of keening. So, if any of you are familiar with the folkloric figure of the Banshee, then you have some familiarity with keening. The ghostly female apparition whose shriek announced death was born out of hearing the discordant wails of the keening song. And it captures what I think is the essence of keening as a ritual, which is the invitation to be haunted. This invitation to be haunted shares so many similarities with Gothic aesthetics, from an understanding of time being cyclical and layered and fragmented, to the use of sound to convey emotion, that it seemed really an appropriate subject for a discussion of Gothic practices. Now, in spite of how spooky being haunted may sound, I found that in researching Keening and coming to understand its ontological position towards death, that it provided something which I think we've steadily lost in our own society today. So, in this talk, I want to juxtapose the relationship to death and time established by Keening with our own contemporary capitalist beliefs on those subjects in order to understand how the inability to truly mourn has exacerbated our feelings of alienation and isolation. So, the title of my paper, Mourning Praxis, essentially contends that the structured actions of mourning found in Keening are so because they emerge from a particular way of conceptualizing time. In my mind, rituals of burial and mourning often remain neglected or relegated to the category of like superstition, myth, faith, and so on, especially in regards to folk traditions and beliefs. I think there's still a tendency to like romanticize them instead of grappling with them as material social phenomenon. So, in attempting to understand keening on its own terms, I had to find a way of kind of unifying the material and performative qualities of the keening song, as well as the Irish wake and the burial proceedings, with this ontological construction of time, which allows the dead to haunt, in effect, the living community. This involved expanding my own Marxist critique to accommodate a practice which embraced irrationality and immateriality as part of daily life. And the question kind of became what framework to come to terms with the spiritual and folkloric as part of a materialist worldview. So this framework, which is called Gothic Marxism, apropos for the conference, I think, it's been primarily theorized by the fiction writer China Miéville and theorist Margaret Cohen. So put simply, Gothic Marxism is distinguished by the valorization of a culture's ghosts and phantasms as a significant and rich field of social production, rather than a mirage to be dispelled. Both Cohen and Miéville argue that even under capitalism, industrialization, and colonialism, these unique cultural beliefs have persisted. A lot of them still exist today in some form. They refer to these practices as cultural detritus, but I counter that these beliefs actually have transformed into forms of survivance, which is a term that I'm going to more thoroughly unpack and define a bit later on. I want to stress that what's important in this mode of analysis, it's embracing beliefs and ideas which have become marginalized and repressed precisely because of their persistence and their inability to be assimilated into capitalism. The fact that they've continued and maintained themselves and connect the people who practice them to their identity and cultural heritage makes them, I think, a really important tool in ultimately overcoming and progressing past our capitalist society. So now for the really fun part that everyone's looking forward to. What is the teleological purpose of mourning? Nice chipper subject for first thing. One might argue that it's like a necessary externalization of grief, or perhaps it's totally involuntary. I think sociologically, one can make the claim that it's part of maintaining social cohesion. And I think all of these are reasonable answers, but I think that the most useful definition comes from Derrida, who says, mourning consists always in attempting to ontologize remains, to make them present. In the first place, by identifying the bodily remains and by localizing the dead, to know who and where, to know whose body it really is and what place it occupies, for it must stay in its place. So, mourning is this act of establishing the social relation of the deceased and the living. It establishes the material location and, by extension, the social location of that person within their community. I'm arguing that keening as a form of mourning praxis unifies a specific relationship to death and a specific conception of how time passes with a ritualistic praxis. Keening was a distinct style of sean-nós folk singing sung by female members of the deceased during the wake. As a style of music, it's more akin to like an atonal soundscape, with its emphasis being on the articulation of the spoken word instead of melody. It's versified according to the Rosk meter, which is the oldest recorded poetic meter in Ireland, and involved improvised lyrics, which were entirely situational and specific to the dead and the impact they had on the community. The women leading the Keating song, who are called the Van Quinte, would deliver an a cappella verse, which would be segmented by a communal and polyphonic wail called a gol. Furthermore, the Banquinte would augment the Keening song with exaggerated gestures of grief, such as gnashing teeth, pulling hair out. And the result of all these elements of this performance was the creation of a sonic liminal space during which the community could experience the implied spectral presence of the dead. The keening song, along with other aspects of the wake and burial, generated this excess of consciousness through which the deceased maintained their place within the memory of their community. It was this invitation to be haunted, I think perfectly described by Marx Fisher as occurring at a place strained by time, or when a particular place becomes the site for an encounter with broken time. And the soundscape of Keening becomes this encounter with broken time. It shatters, uh, you know, linear time and invites the past in. It established a conception of temporality as being layered. The past, the present, and future are bleeding into each other into a more cyclical process. And life in this state is conceived of like a palimpsest of being, in which one's ancestors, community are all part of oneself. It's kind of this mutual recognition and identification in the act of grieving loss. Even under the long terms of oppression by the Catholic Church and British colonization, keening was maintained as a praxis, most especially in rural Ireland. Bean Kinte would travel from town to town and offer the service of keening the dead in exchange for food, money, and shelter. However, under these repressive conditions, keening acquired a further political dimension and became, as I said in the intro, a form of survivance. So the concept of survivance also originates from Derrida, who you could tell is very important to my studies. Although he only briefly mentions it and defines it essentially as an excess of life which resists annihilation. He talks about it in the context of the archive, of how people are remembered through archival documents. But it's kind of woefully underdeveloped in his own theory. And it wasn't until Gerald Wiesner, a Minnesota Chippewa writer, poet, and scholar, would apply Derrida's conception of survivance to the way indigenous communities have actively resisted the colonial violence of the US government through maintaining their cultural traditions. Wiesner clarifies that survivance pushes beyond mere survival in being an active and embodied part of the community. His extended application of survivance, I think, is a very useful device for post-colonial studies in general. I think you could apply it to any colonized people or colonial situation. And it provides an understanding of the cultural and political aspects of people's traditions and beliefs relative to the history of colonization and occupation. So keening, as a form of survivance, became symbolically representative of Irish identity, both because of its ancient origins and grammatically in tying the contemporaneous death of an individual to their ancestors through devices such as using the Rosk meter. This very particular, old, archaic, poetic meter. To be keened after death was to be Irish in this sense, and the living communities mourning the dead recognized their own cultural identity in this act of mourning. There was a continuity passed down from generation to generation, which became a core part of the political resistance to British occupation. Keening was only, in fact, snuffed out by the encroachment of industrialization. You see, in the relative silence of everyday life prior to industrial production being the main mode of being, that silence allowed for the atonality of the Keening song to be entirely unique to the act of mourning and the event of burying the dead. It could function as that sonic liminal space because one would only hear such destabilizing sounds in that particular situation. However, as atonality became more commonplace, this desired effect became increasingly difficult to achieve. R. Murray Schafer, who's a scholar and environmental activist, particularly who thinks about sound and writes about sound, has a wonderfully simple analogy to describe this shift in the sonic environment. A man with a shovel is not imperialistic, but a man with a jackhammer is, because he has the power to interrupt and dominate other acoustic activities in the vicinity. This sort of sonic imperialism was compounded by the mechanization of time ushered in by industrial production, and Keening would become further marginalized to the point of extinction in the 20th century, not by cultural oppression, but by sonic and temporal imperialism. So, with this understanding of Keening, both as a praxis regarding the acceptance of death and understanding the passage of time, I now want to juxtapose our capitalist society's understanding of time as a form of measurement and the resulting relationship to death which emerges from that. So, if value is determined by the amount of labor produced, then the passage of time becomes a metric of the accumulation of value. Consider how For Keening, the tracking of time according to the position of, say, the sun in the sky or by the passing of seasons inherently views time as cyclical and layered, while the tracking of time by clock and calendar demarcates time as isolated increments. Within the capitalist conception of time, we are eternally trapped in the present. This concept of time constructs a very different relationship to death. With the value of life being determined by labor performed over time, death, as the negation of life, represents a total lack of value, the inability to have value. There's a fragmentary note in the Dialectic of Enlightenment in which Adorno and Horkheimer unpack this capitalist relationship to death. And they say, the disturbed relationship to the dead, who are forgotten and embalmed, is one of the symptoms of the sickness of experience today. Individuals are reduced to a mere succession of instantaneous presents, which leave behind no trace, or rather, the trace which they hate as something irrational, superfluous, utterly obsolete. The positioning of death as valuelessness becomes evident then in the attempt to mechanize the mourning process and structure it as another mode of production. Mourning becomes standardized as the accounting of value, akin to the closure of a ledger. Generally speaking, the act of mourning now takes place at a funeral home, which is a business providing the services of mourning and burial. The wake will feature images of the deceased from when they were alive, and makeup is applied to mask the lack of vitality of the body. People will line up and wait to have very solitary encounters with the body, as opposed to coming together in a communal ritual. Likewise, I think if we expand our view and look at public forms of mourning, such as instances where protesters are murdered by the state, that individuals' comrades will often use their image in signs and banners to represent their cause and demand justice. So, returning to Derrida's definition of mourning as the localization and ontologizing of remains, these aforementioned types of capitalist grieving dislocate and fragment the remains. The remains become multifaceted and scattered. An individual's subjectivity is liquidated in order to become an object of ideology and acquire an exchange value. Their image may be constituted and used to represent anything other than themselves. Our grief, therefore, becomes displaced and contributes to the growing sense of alienation and apathy, which is clawing at our consciousness. The act of mourning is not a coherent recognition of death, therefore, as a natural extension of life, and the dead are not memorialized collectively, but they become an explosion of irrationality, which needs to be snuffed out. I don't know if anyone's ever been to a funeral where this happens, but someone might break down, they might explode with emotion, so to speak, and can no longer contain their grief. And in keening, right, this is part of the ritual and it's invited. But today it's often considered uncouth and inappropriate. I've been at a couple funerals where that's kind of the discussion afterwards. Can you believe how someone acted? Which is kind of silly and ridiculous, but I think that's a common sort of attitude which is taken. I think that part of the reason why it's considered inappropriate per se is that there's a question that emerges then from the capitalist conception of time and death, which is why mourn something which no longer has any value? Prior to this panel, Andy and I had a wonderful conversation where we were introducing ourselves and discussing our particular projects. And part of this conversation regarded the popularity of the Gothic as a mode of thinking today. I think it's noticeably becoming a growing part of our academic discourse. Obviously, right, we're having a conference about Gothic practice, and I don't think this is by like happenstance, because I would say that the central critique of Gothic aesthetics is that the past is always lingering underneath the present, and it can be used to expose the contradictions of contemporary society. I think that's so applicable to our multiple societies today across the world. I think we kind of live in this age of reckoning with the past. I think much like the portrait of Dorian Gray, the transgressions of the past are accumulating and festering, weighing upon the entirety of humanity and driving us all into more desperate and violent circumstances. So I'm insisting, as part of my paper in this conference today, that we must develop our own mourning praxis in order to save ourselves from the violations of the past, or else we will be consumed by our own recklessness. Changing society begins with changing our relationship to time, to death, to each other. And I think it's imperative to start viewing the world in a way divorced from productivity and value, and embracing the inherent irrationality and hauntedness that we're actually living in. I want to conclude really quickly with a quote from Marxist scholar Samuel Tomczyk, who states that communism will be the collective management of our alienation and the mourning of a future we were all promised. Thank you. That's my talk for today.
Thank you very much. Mm, Sorry. Um, so now we're going to jump to Andy, and then we'll have Q&A afterwards. So, Andy, it's your turn.
Okay, great. I mean, although John and I talked at great length a week or so ago, it astounds me just how much in common our research has. As you know, I have a lot to add to what John was saying, a lot to ask him as well. But I think these two papers really speak to each other really well. Although I'm dealing with something very different because I'm dealing with land. So just I've got kind of a paper written here because I have a terrible tendency to ramble and I will take up everybody's time if I'm not tied down to specific words. But before I launch into that, so my contribution to Gothic Studies was originally going to be just a conventional paper about my practice. But being the kind of person that I am, I completely misunderstood what was being asked of me, came up with a huge long paper, which I then couldn't condense down to 2,000 words. So after having the fantastic series of conversations with the editors, decided that I was going to turn the whole thing into a short story, which is what you will see in the edition as Slater's last film, which is sort of using the idea of the Gothic researcher that's drawn out of kind of late Victorian, early 20th century ghost stories like M.R. James. He's the absolute classic. So the what you're seeing is kind of Gothic practice within Gothic practice. So it's kind of double layered. So that was really quite an exciting thing to be able to do. I had a lot of fun doing it. But the paper that I'm going to give is kind of the background to the project which inspired the short story. John has already apologized for not having a slideshow. I will more than make up for that because I have so many pictures, being the kind of person that I am. So let's see. I'm screen sharing and let's see. We okay. Right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Have I got it right? Places of Ghosts and Melancholy, Fake Gothicist methodology. Yeah, got that? Perfect. Right. My doctoral project has been from the outset and remains an exploration of the meanings of English common land and an inquiry into ways of representing these meanings, a film query, to use Agatha Lulkowska's useful expression. My creative work, however, has changed radically along the way. I originally intended making experimental documentaries using forms with which I was already familiar, the essay film, slow cinema, installation. But while my earlier outputs bear traces of these, my final and major output isn't moving image at all, and nor is it documentary, but a folk horror screenplay, The Rewetting of Red Ball Mire. In it, Ruth and Perrin, a young couple, adjust to new life and a new community in an inherited cottage with rights to gather gorse and graze cattle on a neighbouring patch of common heathland, which is going through change. A drained area of bog with a notorious history is to be re-wetted as a conservation measure, and as its history of exploitation and persecution comes to light, Ruth comes to understand what the locals really mean when they tell her that there's always been a Ruth at Hunger Hill Cottage. When she revives an annual beating of the bounds, things turn bloody. In this paper, I'll explore why and how this pivot happened and the insights which have arisen as a result. It helps to explain a bit about common land, as it's here that things came unstuck. It's widely held in England that commons belong to no one, or to the crown, or to everyone. And while some commons do belong to no one, and some do belong to the crown, nearly all common land is privately owned by someone or some organisation, like the National Trust, the UK's largest landowner, or Newcastle City Council, in the case of Newcastle Town Moor, which is the image that you see here. It's a huge area of green space, larger than Central Park, right in the middle of Newcastle, and people still graze cows on there. It's quite extraordinary. None of it belongs to everyone, or ever has. It's widely believed that the English started losing their commons, and along with it, our freedom, when the Normans invaded, and that the titled and wealthy have been stealing them from us in England ever since. And while not exactly untrue, this is a very partial picture with its own fascinating history. Ask a common scholar what a common is, and they'll for the most part agree that it's land over which no single party has a controlling stake, and importantly, that what is shared in common isn't actually the land, but the things people, the commoners, use there, like grassland for grazing livestock, woodland for gathering mushrooms, a beach for sand, or heathland gorse for burning. You'll see a distribution of commons around around England there, and Wales as well. There's even a common in Surrey, near to London, where the neighbouring estate, or as you would call it, housing project, has rights to hang out washing. This and their histories mean commons are hugely varied places. Meadows, riverbanks, mountainsides, parks, moorland, verges, woodland, duck ponds, playing fields, even a few car parks. It also means, as most of England's commons no longer have active commoners, these technically aren't commons. This was the main problem of my thesis. So what exactly are they? Even their legal status is often hazy. So what unites them as a category, and how then to translate this audio visually? The answers to these questions can be found in part in what they mean and with what they are associated. Nostalgia for lost pastoral freedoms, trauma at violent loss, wilderness, folk communities, mindful balance with more than human worlds, rituals and legends, countercultures and resistance, the last vestiges of an almost extinct pre-modern way of life. This is why I think it intersects really well with John's paper. And the conflicts, traditions, and misperceptions arising from all of this. Here are all the makings of folk horror. And it's notable that the recent adaptation of Harvest, John Crace's historical enclosure novel, uses folk horror imagery, but this still doesn't explain why I made this turn, and the reasons are quite personal. I first visited Groveley Wood early on in my studies, a 2,000-acre common wood about 7 miles away from Stonehenge in Wiltshire. Enclosed briefly in the late 18th century, the villagers of Great Wishford fought for over a century to have their rights restored to gather nuts and fallen woods. Each Oak Apple Day, May 29th, as for the past 400 years, they reclaim their rights in an elaborate ritual which involves gathering boughs of trees at dawn, hoisting the largest up the church tower, then heading off to shout, "Groveley, Groveley, Groveley," and all Groveley at the Bishop of Salisbury, who is, I hasten to add, expecting them to do this. The wood abounds with prehistoric sites, ruins, ancient trees, and myths and legends of monsters, violent murder, and resistance. And each of these centres on women, which is unusual for a common. All very interesting, all very folk horror, but this still wasn't the main reason I made my first film at Groveley. I've suffered episodes of dysthemic depression since adolescence, and have, like many others, headed to the woods when things get a bit much. Throughout my life, my nearest commons have been largely wooded, and so Groveley felt familiar both aesthetically and effectively. Groveley hasn't been especially well looked after. Plundered for forestry plantation in the early 20th century and to store wartime munitions. Such neglect and beauty combine as a powerful mood that even springtime carpets of bluebells can't budge. It's this mood, melancholy, which has connected me to such places before. It wasn't just in woodlands I'd sought melancholy, though. I'd also sought it in books and films, in Gothic and in horror. Melancholy is a complex term, which, unlike fear and disgust, has received scant attention in conjunction with Gothic and horror. As far as I can tell, Its resistance to easy depiction is a defining feature, but it's most narrowly defined as a form of sadness, essentially without object, having outlasted or lacking entirely any specific causes, and thus associated with a generalized sense of loss, absence, and transience. In his influential essay, Freud distinguishes melancholy as incomplete or deviant mourning. According to Jackie Bowring, it's a constellation of concepts, while Laura Salmon draws on the similar term tosca, which describes a hybrid feeling whose basic elements may include sadness, depression, angst, grief, languor, ennui, and longing. Walter Benjamin described a whirlpool around which the prehistory and post-history of an event, or better, of a status, swirl around. It's also described as a state of accentuated self-consciousness, which Matthew Bell identifies with secular Western conceptions of self. Such wide applicability makes melancholy versatile and lively, and also a little bit slippery. Melancholy shares fundamental concerns with Gothic and horror. Its pathological forms are associated with the irrational, trauma, and the temporal disjunction of madness, mortality, and grief, especially in the case of depressive suicide. Pathological melancholy is historically linked with spirit and demonic possession, supernatural forces, and witchcraft, both causing and being caused by melancholy. Melancholy is, like Gothic, characterized both positively and negatively in terms of deviance and transgression, and as a liminal state which lacks clear borders between, for instance, day and night, good and evil, or life and death. As a term for pathological sadness, melancholia was ousted by depression in the early 19th century and was thereafter often presented as a spirited sadness or sweet melancholy, in some ways pleasurable, the beginning of philosophy, and even desirable. Melancholy, while still problematic, is seen as engendering a sense of heightened awareness, insight, and can be a response to a generalized sense of unease within a hostile social, political, or ecological context, as often the case is in Gothic. A valued state, rather than one to be medicalized away, according to Jackie Bowring, it offers a possibility of transforming despondency or being with difficult emotions rather than rejecting them. She points to contemplative melancholizing as an imaginative activity, which, by extension, suggests imagining narratives. Elliot Borenstein points out how the melancholic is embedded into the narrative world of HBO's The Leftovers to engender melancholic encounters and experiences. Laura Salmon describes a melancholic creative style, which is a way or mode of looking at and experience and narrating it, while Pietrze Sinoziewski describes a melancholic gaze which pierces passionlessly through the finite world and through which no hidden meaning or hope exists. A melancholic attitude is thus, in part, an intentional form of reading, rewriting, and attribution, which relies on entertaining an effective response to recognizably melancholic signifiers. If melancholy is, in part, a refusal to move on, this can be a consciously and productively political standpoint. In the early aughts, Mark Fisher identified traces of lost or unrealized utopian dreams in unsettling but retro-themed music, literature, and screen media, a reflex he famously described, following Derrida, as hauntological, and for which, he said, melancholy is the most appropriate response. This is not just nostalgia for an imagined better past, but the resumption of the processes of democratization and pluralism, which are now absent. Joseph Winters goes further, describing melancholy as a strategy by which the marginalized, repressed, and othered, he is referring here to Black Americans, refuse the compromises of easy integration into a homogeneous narrative, and which draws on older cultural forms. In this case, blues, sorrow songs, and folk legend. Like critical melancholy or the melancholic gaze, it is an attitude but a politically motivated one. Its emphasis on slowing down, contemplation, and solitude is also profoundly at odds with consumer capitalism and the Protestant work ethic. Just as a side note, I really wish Winters had lent into the Gothic. He nearly gets there. He starts talking about Toni Morrison, but doesn't really get into the meat of Beloved. And I would have loved to find out what he thought of the recent Candyman reboot, because I think it articulates exactly what he's talking about. Commonland is apt for such encounters. Its liminality, and histories of weakened hegemonic social norms and transgression afford introspection, solitude, and irrational thoughts. I think commons are a really good example of what John was referring to as survivance. This is exactly the kind of thing. Jackie Bowring, in fact, identifies a typology of melancholic qualities found in places: ruins, decay, shadows, darkness, silence, the uncanny, submersion, all characteristic of the places of Gothic and of horror. Groveley's noiseless plantations, dark tracks, and overgrown bunkers offered many of these and felt consolingly familiar from my first visit onwards. I found myself relaxing into imaginative reveries which, since childhood, have included ghosts and were fed by what I'd learned about Groveley. I did try to make an essay film about the place, but extracting myself from my affective imaginative experience felt forced and disingenuous. The film I went on to make, Clutes, which features in the contribution to Gothic Studies, reworks Groveley's histories and myths, imagining Grace Reed imprisoned for gathering wood from the then enclosed Groveley, being visited in dreams by the four murdered Hansel sisters, on whose graves giant beeches sprang up, and three of these still exist. This is a gathering together of different histories and folk myths of this woodland. I then tried following up Clutes with an essay film, but there was no going back. After combing the archives of the Pebblebed Heaths and East Devon network of commons, I had enough material for a screenplay. Working in fiction from the outset allowed me to shape, alter, and invent to draw out the meanings I'd been identifying, creating characters whose speech and actions could embody these and set them into conflict. I was able to place melancholy and haunting centrally as the titular Red Ball Mire, and which exerts a disruptive influence on those who seek to define, dominate, and otherwise willfully misunderstand it. Its inspiration is this boggy area, partly drained for a nearby stately homes fountain, funded in part, it turned out, by new wealth acquired through the slave trade. And expanding this connects my work to important contemporary debates and gave me an ending which considers race and national identity. There is an unfortunate tendency within a lot of discussion about commons and folklore, which is rather racist and nationalistic, as happens in many other countries. I was also able to interrogate different ways of thinking about folk, whether lost pastoral, lost agency, relations with more than human worlds, counterculture, national essence, ideas of belonging, or the local. As with much folk horror, my screenplay's horror, no spoiler, but it does involve cows, emerges out of its folk, although not of a unified collective folk, but out of conflicts between different interpretations of folk and in conjunction with the screenplay's Gothic, mythical, and supernatural elements. As Matthew Cheeseman, Paul Cordell, and others point out, that word folk is highly charged and, like the Mire, has problematic roots in colonial era anthropology and in ethno-nationalist projects, which are of increasing relevance to the present. As a signifier, whether of actual people or rituals, places, and artifacts, folk can also be used as a way of othering and simultaneously sentimentalizing and dismissing the rural. Who is and is not the folk, what demarcates them, is therefore highly politically charged. So, to conclude, English common land, it turned out, can be productively thought of in terms of melancholy as a way of considering lost futures, liminal space, historical trauma, and the anxieties of the present. This makes possible a knowing radicalism which neither ignores nor dwells on the past, and an effective interface with more than human agency. So too can it be thought of in terms of folk horror. The tensions between different meanings given to a rural past and the communities with which it is associated. While it's a current adoption by English land rights protest groups such as Right to Roam and The Stars Are for Everyone similarly evidences its radical potential, melancholy brings in check any inherited fundamentalist, especially nationalist impulses. Bringing folk horror and melancholy together therefore allows for a criticality, a weakening of absolutism and anthropocentrism, more akin to what Dawn Keatley describes as folk Gothic. Perhaps most importantly of all, this pivot allowed me to put my own experience more fully into my work and transform it into a valuable reflective mode. But perhaps most important of all, it was enormous and indulgent fun and immensely satisfying. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Those were both wonderful. And yay, we have plenty of time for questions. So I would love to open it up for questions. If you're online and you want to put something in the chat or here in the room. Oh, yes, we have one in the room.
Hi, thank you to wonderful papers. I had a question for John, which I was very interested in your kind of notion of building your own mourning practice, sort of in the face of capitalism. My specific study is in the transgender community and horror and Gothic and so on. I'm just interested, so quite a lot in the UK at least, with loss of members of our community, we will kind of have vigils. I'm just interested, I suppose, in broadly whether or not you think it's maybe easier to build your own mourning practices as a community when you're already being othered by the state, and whether it is people who are kind of more able to follow the status quo, who are kind of being isolated from their own mourning practices because of being more kind of accepted under capitalism.
Thanks so much for that question. I think that the simple answer is yes. I think people who are being already marginalized by the state definitely are more inclined to reconsider their relationship to death, loss, the passage of time. And it goes to the sense of rethinking about being, whether it's gender identity and presentation, your political stance. I think all of those things translate into a reconsideration of, life and death, the meaning of those two things, and the passage of time. But I think something that shouldn't be lost is that I think it's a pervasive cultural condition that I think even if you're trying to resist it, it's always um, representing itself. I think that's part of the nature of capitalism is that the moment we find new forms of resistance, or in this case, mourning, capitalism is trying to find a way to assimilate those and, commodify them, reify them. So I think it's a kind of constant awareness, and maybe it's more of a process rather than deciding on a specific sort of practice and deciding, well, this is how I mourn and it's anti-capitalist. It's more of like, how do we continue to develop and grow these different mourning practices? I hope that answered your question.
Yeah,
I've
very much.
actually got something to add to that, which is based on some of the reading that I've been doing. So it's only a small portion of it, but it's been really useful. So there's there's a writer who's drawn on a lot of queer melancholia studies, of which there's a lot, and recontextualized it in an ecological context. So that's that's the only paper that I can really speak to because I haven't really looked at the research that he's drawing on. Um, but but basically, sorry, what she's drawing on, Catriona. But what she was saying was that some lives are considered to be ungrievable, and what she was looking at specifically was the mourning of people who had died during the AIDS pandemic, and she was looking at the way that some queer artists, Derek Jarman was one, I can't remember the other one, went to natural places, more than human places that have been devastated, places that are not considered sort of conventionally attractive, but ways of kind of being with feelings without feeling that they need to be got over. And I think this is kind of one of the ways that in some ways, although John's talking about mourning and I'm talking about melancholy, I think in the way that John's framing this, the two things are a little bit closer. Because and to speak to the kind of this capitalist mode that mourning has become a process, and I think this is something that Freud was saying, and I think this is a problem. That there's a beginning to mourning and there's an end to mourning. It's something you've got to get over so you can get back to work, get on with being productive again. These are different phases of mourning. Once you get to the final phase, that's it. You finish mourning and you're back to being a productive, cheerful member of society. Whereas melancholy is saying there are some things that you don't have to get beyond, and that you shouldn't, especially when the things that are a problem, as with, the ecological crisis, or, or persecuted minority groups, um, that we shouldn't get over this, that this is something that does need to be kind of held on to, which is, what Joseph Winters goes to at enormous length. It's a fantastic book if you haven't come across it. Really, it's called Hope Draped in Black. I really, really recommend it. But sorry, I just wanted to jump in there because I think it's kind of relevant to this point.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And that idea of kind of going back to the land and to sort of abandoned spaces and stuff keeps coming up in my research as well. Kind of rewilding space and rewilding the way that we kind of grieve and honor our communities. So thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Okay, we have one from the chat. Both of you have an aspect to your work concerned with public community practices in a now capitalist neoliberal society that values independence over community. What sorts of practices would both of you like to see us evolve to honor communal practices in this day and age, and how do we get there?
I think it's an excellent question. Thank you for putting it forward. Um, I think in terms of communal practices, I'd like to see, I think I'll have to portray myself and say, I don't know if I have a specific one in mind. I think I'm really fascinated by this Samuel Tomsic quote about the collective management of our alienation. And I think that that's sort of a jumping off point for me as I've been thinking more and more, especially finishing this paper about, yeah, like how do we approach mourning? What does post-capitalist mourning look like? And I think that part of it is embracing the fact that, in Marx's train of thought, it's that it's not necessarily destroying capitalism, but it's working through the contradictions of capitalism. So we have this mode of mourning, which is a mechanized process. And I think it's how do you expand that to be more communal? I think one of the ways is to embrace emotion. I think to Andy's previous point, it's kind of like a thing you move past your emotions to get back to work. And I think that's really where the individuality translates into alienation. The fact that, you shouldn't feel deep emotions, you shouldn't express your emotions, I think comes out of the sense that, we're alienated from our emotions. I think to the second question of how we get there, I think it's kind of like a nested issue, right? And I think that as probably with most of the topics we're discussing, um, these issues radiate out into each other. So there's ecological, political, personal, historical dimensions, cultural dimensions to the question of mourning, melancholia, and I think with Andy, what I loved in his presentation, he unpacked melancholy as this historical category, which is grown and transformed, and has a very problematic past that we shouldn't forget, but I think could be potentially um, turned or transformed into a mode of thinking about history and loss and trauma, as opposed to being something that's sort of weaponized against people. And so I think that that is how I would structure it. That is, we should be thinking about transforming the practices we do have and trying to expand them to be more communal, to focus on like the acceptance of death. I maybe have a bit more to say, but I'll stop there for now.
Well, thanks for the question. It couldn't be more relevant to my thesis, really. I mean, because the history of the loss of the commons is all about the loss of local autonomy over in for subsistence, the sort of the privatization of land, the marketization of the whole economy, the loss of folk traditions. It's and this is sort of there, there's a wealth of kind of very popular meanings for what this means, which I feel have kind of drowned out the really important thing is the fact that local communities have over the centuries lost a say over how their communities are run. Um, this is sort of, this is sort of very well typified through the loss of common land, but is found in, all sorts of other things like the way that, bus services don't run very well. You hardly have them, but I mean, we're losing them. These kind of remote rural bus services, we're losing those. And also, that when the commons were lost, these communal spaces were lost, and the traditions, the shared traditions, which kept them active, such as the one which I mentioned, this balmy one, which is in which is in attached to Gravely Wood. um they are their community expressions. And one of the things that's very sad is the village where this is happening, because it's in a because it's near Stonehenge, it's in a beautiful part of the country. They're getting more and more Airbnbs moving in, so the traditions are starting to weaken because there's less people who live in this village. um and I think it's there is a very strong movement in the UK. So we're in the middle of what is being described as the third folk revival. So the first folk revival in the UK was in the kind of early years of the 20th century. It was very, very misogynistic, very class-based, but nevertheless, it was collecting a lot of these traditions before they died out. So it was very, very valuable work, but it was imbued with some very unpleasant politics. Then you've got the second folk revival, which comes from the States originally, so from the late 1950s, from the folk revival there, coming over here and re-energizing folk traditions. Then you've got the psychedelic 60s, which kind of turbocharged all of that, and then it starts to die off again in the 1970s. So there's kind of utopianism that's inherent in that. But the third wave folk revival is kind of looking back at both of these, looking at these disturbing colonial roots, but also looking at some of the false ideologies of the 1960s, and the kind of hedonistic utopias, and looking at those, and also looking out at what's going on in our world right now. This is a devastatingly dangerous time. The planet's on fire. We've God only knows what's going to happen with this super El Nino that has just begun. So it's embracing all of those, and it's a very dark folk revival. So this is why folk horror is a very, very major part of it. And it's also something that's, because of that, is very much more inclusive. So it's something which is more sort of a feeling rather than a heritage movement. So one of the things that's been great is that Morris dancing, which is the traditional type of folk dancing, which goes back a couple of centuries, which in the first folk revival was turned into something that only men do, which was nonsense. That wasn't part of its history at all. Now women are doing folk dancing, and there's also an explosion of black folk singers as well, who are sort of looking back at the black British experience, going back centuries, bringing those out. There's an incredible singer called Angeline Morrison, and again, it's melancholy, because it's looking at the things that have been lost and looking at all you know the the terrible legacy of everything that's happened over the past hundreds of years. But it's also looking at everything that has been retained with an enormous sense of love, and holding those two things in check, which I think is really remarkable. So, I mean, I suppose in answer to your question, I mean, there is a uh, I I think sort of politically there is a push to try to get more local, say, over green spaces. These are mainly grassroots movement, but have the ear of some politicians. Um, but also this revitalization, revitalization of folk traditions. I think which is more widely, and of which folk horror is an important part. It's a huge conversation, and I'm sure that all of you are aware of that to some extent. But it's a very big thing in this country, which is where the folk horror revival really kind of began about 20 years ago. So yeah, that's it. And more folk horrors, please.
Oh, let's see. The message. I'd love to hear what, let's see, this is from the chat. I'd love to hear what John thinks about the process of discovering heritage and recognizing existing family patterns that you didn't realize connected to older patterns of mourning, as well as creating new patterns based on those. Also, for Andy, I wanted to know who you think about, or what you think about old cemeteries as a site for meeting community or exploring the past.
Thanks for that question. What do I think about discovering heritage? It's interesting because I think it ties to the impetus of writing my paper, which was attending a funeral. of someone very close to me. I don't want to bore you guys with all the details, but essentially, I went through this funeral process and hospice, and I was struck by a lot of my observations about, you could say, capitalist mourning came out of that, which was a lot of arguments around the way people ought to be grieving. I think as a child too, at some of the funerals I attended, this was kind of an ongoing discussion of what's appropriate and what you ought to be doing. And it's contradictory, right? Like I've heard both that you should be more emotional, you're not emotional enough. And then also if someone's too emotional, it's like, I can't believe how emotional you're getting about this. You need to have kind of a solemn dignity in the face of death. And so I think that it propelled me to start trying to ask my family and my friends' families about the ways in which they grapple with mourning and how that emerged out of their own heritage. And so I think it's worthwhile in the sense of understanding your individual relationship to death and dying. I think, of course, that radiates out from your family, and I think inevitably you inherit a lot of those attitudes and ideas, whether willingly or traumatically. Um, and I think in terms of using those to create new patterns. I think it's just about maintaining an awareness of the origins of those traditions. So in the case of Keening, um, the reason I chose that specifically, one is I think it's very appropriate model and very interesting practice, but also it's my family's heritage. My grandmother's from Belfast. My other grandparents are from Dublin, and so is Irish culture something that's kind of always been present, and I think something I took for granted for the longest time, and only now in my, I guess you could say, like young adulthood, I've come to appreciate how much that's had an effect on my worldview, my way of dealing with emotions, communicating with people. So I think that it's very important. I would maybe, in terms of returning to the talk, um, Gerald Wiesner has this other concept tied to survivance called gossip theory, which is the way in which a community um, establishes their cultural heritage and history through discussion and conversation as opposed to archival documents. So he gives the example of like, um, on the reservation, the Chippewa reservation, you have people saying like, "Oh, I remember your uncle. Your uncle told me this, and this is remember that." And like, your mother being like, "Remember your mother always told you this." And those are ways of passing along like generational knowledge and traditions as opposed to like uh cementing them in stone. I think tying that into Keening, that was kind of an issue of researching. And I think if anyone wants to go down the rabbit hole of Keening, you'll find that there's a kind of core issue, which is that the people who actually practice Keening did not write down anything about it. It was taught from one woman, an older woman to a younger woman. It was like a generational and very like private, personal. Um, you kind of say like a cult, if you will. It was kind of hidden knowledge. And the people who are writing about it and are documenting the practice are always outsiders. You know what I mean? They're coming into it and saying, I don't really know what's going on, but I'm observing these are the proceedings. And it's kind of missing um the cultural and personal connection to the practice. So it's always a bit disjointed and disconnected and if you could say maybe flailing for an answer at times. So I think in that way it's embracing, I think to answer the question, it's embracing those heritages, but also maintaining like a critical distance, understanding that they're contextually emerging from a set of histories, traditions, other people's generational trauma. And, I think in that way, it's inverting or embracing things that are meaningful to you or useful to you in the moment is the way kind of to establish new patterns.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
I've quickly got a question for you, John. How do we get to hear Keening? Is there somewhere that's really good? 'Cause I've never heard this. You've painted a really good picture of it. I can kind of imagine it, but it would be really great to actually hear the real thing.
I can put in the chat, but I think the best facsimile of Keening, and I'm serious, this is probably the best facsimile, but it's Robin Williams and Carol Burnett performing a keen together, where he's describing this tradition and he's on the Carol Burnett show and describing Keening. And I think they actually approximate. It's obviously more comedic, than serious, but I think they get at the kind of atonality and the very loose structure of it quite well. So I would say that that's what I think is maybe the best example. There's some other people who have recreated it very seriously, but I can put some videos in the chat or share them with, uh, you know, people later
Yeah,
on.
that'd be great. I'm so interested. But and by the way, there's an absolute explosion in Irish folk horror. So that's maybe a conversation for another time. So Jan, thank you for your question. So it's not, I mean, it's a great question. It's not, my answer's not going to have anything to do with my paper, but it is something that I'm really invested in. So I was lucky enough to be in a cemetery in Mexico for the Day of the Dead in the 90s, like this tiny little village in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And the English, and I imagine in the US, from judging from what John's saying, is very similar because our cultures have got these common connections. We're very, very stuffy about death in England. I think that's changing. I think that's changing more as a kind of a working class movement towards it actually than anywhere else. But always been very stuffy. All our cemeteries are on the edge of town, and you go there to kind of put flowers on the graves, and that's it. It's nothing like in Latin American countries where people go to clean the gravestones every week or every month or whatever. Um, and it completely, I mean, the Day of the Dead is just incredible. It's just, and you eat food and you have wonderful conversations with people and you drink kind of, spiced coffee, and then everybody gets pissed, well, in English sense, the word drunk, as soon as the sun came up, and my goodness, did people get drunk. Um, so, this idea of convivere, living together with the dead, I thought was just wonderful. I'd never heard anything like it, that when you're in the cemetery, you're not just remembering them, you're with them, because their spirits are there for that particular night. So it really changed things. And obviously we have all these wonderful Victorian cemeteries. Lived near one actually when I was in Exeter. I'm now in Bristol. And I think there's still a sense of reserve. I mean, I run through it, other people ran through it, people walk their dogs there, but you have it, there's still a quietness, a sense of kind of reserve there. That these are places not to kind of let your emotions go. Now, however, I'm in Bristol, which is a much more kind of, I don't know how much you guys know about the UK, but Bristol is a very kind of left-wing, sort of radical, queer-friendly. We have a Green MP. It's got a really vibrant music scene. It's a very, very different place, very politically radical. Um, and so my nearest green space is a cemetery, and people picnic there, which I've not seen before. I mean, because it's the nearest green space, and I think that's great. It's not, and it is still a cemetery that's being used as such. There are still new graves, um, and I think it's great. I really do. I think children are much more in tune with the potential for cemeteries as places to play. I mean, there's amazing, children's stories that are set in old graveyards, and I think that this is one of the appeals of the Gothic. I think you can sort of extend those engagements into adulthood. Um, but yeah, children, I think, are very much alive to it. So it's yeah. I think meeting communally, I think they're fantastic places. But because people are so dissipated now. I mean, I think if you've got a graveyard, um, probably most people who live near it, certainly if it's in a nicer part of town, like where I live, then probably most of the people around there don't actually have relatives in there. So maybe that's something more in rural communities, but I think those are still much more kind of have these conservative, very restrained views. But yeah, as I said, I think that's changing. I mean, one of the things that people are doing, it's not always a great thing, but people are decorating graves with like wind chimes and LED lights, which are solar powered, and Some people really go to town with the graves, especially if it's, somebody who's died rather earlier than would have been expected. Um, so yeah, I think that's coming in, but I think that's kind of more of an urban and suburban thing than something that you'd find rural. So I think it's changeable. I think that's more kind of on a family basis rather than a local community sort of thing. But yeah, I think more picnicking in graveyards would be good, definitely.
Yeah, thank you. It actually does come out of a lot of family. We would gather for Thanksgiving. My one of my uncles was a pastor in a very small town in Michigan, and we would gather, and there was a cemetery right across the street, and we were always in it. We're like all the time. So, the family, the kids especially, as you say. So thank you.
Oh, I want to thank
Oh,
our presenters. Oh, did you have something to add, John?
yeah, I just wanted to add, it's very quick, but in terms of Andy talking about people putting wind chimes or LED screens on tombstones, that if anyone saw David Cronenberg's last film, The Shards, a big premise of the film is the protagonist is kind of a tech billionaire type figure, and his business is creating these LED tombstones in which you can view the dead body of you can view it's like sensor cloak that allows you to view the body as it's decaying, and that's a huge premise throughout is kind of like what does that mean, and it's very I think kind of like Gothic futurist adaptation of that. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I think it's an interesting evolution and interpretation of that idea.
Yeah, and thank you for that. Because we've also had some good recommendations in the chat as well. So be sure to check those out, and I will be sharing them. But yes, I wanted to thank John and Andy for a fantastic presentation. It was a really interesting, and it I knew your pieces connected, but this made it even more solid in my head. So it was thrilling. Um, we will be back in just a few minutes at 11:15 Detroit time. Uh, and I should know it because, yes, Detroit's Gothic Consciousness. So this will be a presentation from Wayne State graduate students. So stick around. But again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you as well. Appreciate everyone being here this morning too.